Okay, so welcome to macro development for advanced users. We'll be covering today some of the upcoming trainings that you have available to you, workflow background in terms of what do I need to know in order to execute an iterative macro, and what use case we'll be covering today. Designer training, so we're actually going to show you a hands-on use case, and then finally finish up with some of the support that you have available to you. Upcoming here in the month of October, we'll have the sixth part of our intro series, the sixth and final part, the Alteryx Gallery and Best Practices. Following the week after that, we'll have tips and tricks, workflow optimization. So what we're going to do in this training is show you some existing workflows and how you might tweak them to make them run even 2 times as fast. So it'll be a unique session that you could probably implement into some of the workflows that you've built out today. For the remainder of the month, we'll have some spatial analytics for beginners. We'll introduce you to the Dun & Bradstreet analytics package. If you have purchased that as part of your organization, you can join in and follow along. If you have not and just want to see what it's all about, feel free to join. In November, we'll have a session on Introduction to Alteryx Reporting, Analytic App Development for Intermediate Users, Using Experian Consumer View Data, and then the basics of data investigation. Great. So the first recommendation before we get into it is that if you have any questions that come out of this session today, feel free to go to the Alteryx community. Alteryx community is a great place to share your thoughts and questions with like-minded peers. Go ahead and enter a question or upload a workflow that you're having trouble with, and find that your answers will be responded to quickly and logically. If you come across a part of the designer that you feel like could be enhanced, or you have an idea of how to make it better, you could also go to the Alteryx community and submit your bright idea to help us improve our products. The great part is that our products team does review these ideas, and they will mention inside that ideas page if it's planned as part of the next release. Then finally, share your knowledge. If you find yourself to be an expert in one particular area, you could write long, lengthy posts or even blog posts about your experience and your expertise. Okay, so for today's training, background that we need to know before we get into iterative macros. Today we'll have a specific use case, and it's going to be very oversimplified, and I'm sure many businesses will have many different rules around this, but it's the simple concept of supply and demand. Okay, we have a number of business locations and a number of warehouse locations, and what we want to do is use an iterative macro to prioritize how we ship supply and demand. If I have a store that has a demand of 10 widgets, for example, I'd want to ship it from my closest store and not my furthest away store. So there's the piece where I have to optimize what warehouses ship to what locations based on supply and demand. Some of the tools that will be covered today are the macro input and output, as is necessary for every type of macro. And one tool that we will use that you may not be experienced with, but really isn't a tool itself, is the interface designer. So we're going to walk through that and what you can do with the interface designer. We'll be using join multiple times to complete our macro. We'll be using it union a few times, and then some other simpler tools like sort and filter. So macro types, what types do we have? There are 3 basic types of macros that we can deliver through the Alteryx designer. The first of which is a standard macro. A standard macro is essentially one stable, repeatable process that you can plug into your workflow at any time and it runs through. A standard macro you can think of as essentially a workflow where it runs through once and it completes. There's really no twists and turns on how that macro develops itself. The second one is a batch macro. A batch macro is a way of cross-sectioning your data and running through different parameters based on different types of data that you have available. Those 2 types of macros, both standard and macro, you can find inside our macro development for the intermediate user. We do develop it in that course. Today, for the advanced user, we'll be walking the third type, which is the iterative macro. So how do I change my macro type within my designer? By simply clicking on the white space of your canvas inside your designer, you'll see this configuration pane pop up on the left side, and by default, it's going to show the Canvas tab. Simply, you can toggle over to your Workflow tab, select Macro, and then choose the type of macro that you want. The iterative macro is interesting in the sense that it is the only type of macro that is not automatically detected by Designer. So let's go ahead and look at our Designer really quick and see that by default, whenever you open a new canvas inside of Designer, the type is standard workflow. So if I'm building out my workflow, even though it may be erroneous at this point, let's go ahead and bring in a macro input, for example, and see what happens. Watch what happens on the left side of my macro. You see it toggle over. It became a type of macro because I'm using a macro input tool, and it says, hey, I know this is going to be a macro workflow. It's going to be a macro file type. I'm going to switch it to standard macro. And that's the behavior whenever I use most of the macro tools. However, if you drop a control parameter onto your canvas, it's going to switch your workflow to be a batch type macro. The interesting about the iterative macro is no matter what you drag onto your canvas, it's never going to automatically detect iterative macro. So what I would encourage everybody to do when building an iterative macro is go over to workflow, select the drop down, and select iterative macro. Now, when you do select iterative macro, one thing will unlock, and I'll toggle back here for a quick second so you can see it, is look at the constants that we have available within our workflow runtime settings. As soon as I select iterative macro, it'll give me iteration numbers, okay? So this has to do with the pure essence of what an iterative macro is. So let's take a look at what an iterative macro is and what we should use it for. So let's say I get into a place where I'm building a workflow and I feel that I'm being very redundant while building a workflow. So for example, here I have a workflow where someone is adding two investment amounts together and multiplying them by 0.5, adding a filter tool to say, is it less than 2,000 now, true or false, and then continuing to do that same process over and over and over, and then unioning the results together to get their final piece. The problem with this is that it can get super redundant. So we see 3 iterations of the same logic, now 4. And even to the point where we've seen workflows like this, where people keep repeating the same tools over and over to conditionally iterate through this logic again and again and again. Well, fear no more, because an iterative macro will save you lots of time. With an iterative macro, you can just build these two tools once, and then continue to circulate through those tools over and over and over again until some sort of condition is met. And that condition is specified by you. It could be a condition specified on the data itself, the number of iterations of the data, which is where we saw that constant come in for the the macro type. So you can specify when that condition should cut off. So here's an example of the new improved macro. 2 tools within these macro input and output tools seems a lot easier. And the nice thing about it is you can run this macro for 1 million iterations. What if the person has only covered roughly 15 iterations and you need to do 100 more? That could be really time consuming. So think of how great it would become as you need more and more and more. So here's an example of the actual behavior, and I'll back up to this animation. Okay, so we have this macro, and essentially we want to go ahead and loop through this logic. This person is basically splitting 2 different types of outputs within his iterative macro. One output will loop through and bring all the records that didn't meet some certain conditions back to the input and pass it through the same logic again, and continue to loop around until the logic's met. If the logic is met, in this case, it might split out the false output and start to essentially union together to create one great output. So what you're about to see is some sort of animation where dots represent a certain amount of records, and I haven't specified specific logic or what numbers they represent, but you can kind of see the behavior of how some loop through while others finally meet a condition and start to fall through the output. Now, certainly if I ran enough loops of certain logic, all of them might fall into this end category. It depends on what you want as the constructor of this iterative macro. Another call out is how to specify what loops where, right? How do I know that these 2 should communicate with each other? This is where that mention I had of the interface designer becomes so critical. So if I go to my interface designer within the view tab of my designer, I can go and select what input should be my iteration input, and what output should connect to that iteration input. And I can specify if I only want it to iterate 100 times, 1,000 times. I could specify one time if I wanted to, although that may be unnecessary. Okay, so when going through and naming these anchors, or sorry, excuse me, these inputs and outputs, it's important to name them something logically, so when you go in here, you know what they represent. You can specify some sort of logic, so what do you want to do if you happen to hit 100 records, or sorry, 100 iterations and your iterative macro has not fully processed all its records? Do you want to error, or do you want it to output what's left over for further analysis? You certainly could choose that. So you do have some options available to you here within the interface designer. Okay, so let's jump over to the designer training and we'll get started. All right, I'm going to create one new workflow here. And we're quickly going to build out an example of our supply and demand. So I'm going to go in, drag in two input data tools, and I'm going to configure them. The first one I want to connect to is my demand data file, demand advanced macro development. I'm going to click open, and then go to the second one and do the same thing, only I'm going to go to supply. So when I look at the files here, you can see I have some sort of longitude and latitude, the demand, which represents a store location, and how much of a certain widget a store wants, and there's a spatial object. Over here, I have a location of all my warehouses and how much widgets they have to supply to a given store. Now, in order to make this a little easier for myself, I'm going to go ahead and add a record ID to each of these so I can track each store and each warehouse. So up here, I'm going to call this my demand ID. And down below, I'm going to call this my supply ID. Now, I want them to be a little bit different in ID value. I just like making it a little bit clear what ID belongs to what. So for the supply ID, I'm going to change the starting value to be something way different. I'm just going to say 2 million, right? We should be more than safe with that unique ID value because I only expect a certain amount, probably only 100 different stores here, or 1,000 or 1,500, right? So I'm going to run that workflow really quickly by pressing Control-R. Certainly you could press this Run Workflow button at the top, and I can look at my data. So it looks like I have 1,800 different stores demanding something or demanding widgets, and about 8 different warehouses that have something to provide. Okay. Now, I know that basically any warehouse can ship to any store. Any sort of combination between those two can exist. So what I'm going to do is propose an append. So I'm going to go to the append tool and essentially cross-join my stores with my warehouse location. And do notice that I do have my smaller data sets, which is my warehouse locations, flowing into my append tool, which is our best practices. So I can go in here and let me update the fields that I want to carry forward out of my append. I certainly want demand ID. I have no need for longitude and latitude because I have spatial objects. Demand is good. I have spatial object here. I might want to rename that because that represents my demand spatial object. So I'm going to type in demand spatial. I'll just call it SO for spatial object. I'll scroll back here. Okay. Supply ID, I will want to carry forward. Object ID, longitude and latitude again, I won't want to carry those. Supply is great, and then I'll call this my supply spatial object so it's clear when I start to measure the distance between these two locations. Let's run that workflow and check it out. So you can see I have my demand ID, the amount that that store wants, and then my warehouse locations, and again, how much they want to supply, and the location in which those two things exist. So now finally, I can calculate a distance in which I can prioritize who ships to who. So going into my spatial palette, I'm going to go ahead and select my distance tool, drop it into my canvas. Needs very little configuration, except I'm going to flip them around a little bit. I'm going to say what's the distance from my supplier to my demand? Sorry, right? So warehouse to store, what's the distance? And you'll see out here at the bottom, I get a distance in miles. And again, I want to prioritize by what's the least distance. So I'm going to go ahead and take my data set, and I'm going to sort it so the shorter distance is at the top of my data set. So selecting the sort, I'm going to go to the distance miles and say ascending, so my lowest is at the top. So you can see in this case, I've got the location of 1472, ID 72, demanding one widget from supply location 2,000,007, and it's only 2.6 miles away. I'd rather ship that 2.6 miles than some of the numbers that we were seeing at the bottom of our data set, like 281. The cost would be greatly different between those two. So after sorting those, I'm going to go ahead and select what I want to carry forward. I'll keep demand ID, demand. I don't need these spatial objects anymore because I have completed my calculation between the two. And I'm going to deselect direction because I won't need direction through the creation of my iterative macro. So essentially, to this point, I'm only preparing data to flow into my iterative macro. So I'm going to run this workflow. I'm going to add a browse using Control-Shift-B and look at my data. I would do this just to inspect it to make sure that it looks like what I want it to be. And at this point, I want to start to build a macro right here after this data set is all in shape, saying who's going to supply who, in what order are they going to supply, when will they be fulfilled. Okay, because certainly a store of with 264 widgets can't supply every demand. Different suppliers will run out of supplies as I start shipping things out. So essentially, I want to build my macro right here. I'm going to build it in a different canvas and then plug it in as a single macro tool. Okay, but in order to do that, I need to know what my data is going to look like going into my macro. So what I'm going to do, and I recommend for best practices everybody do, is go ahead and drag an output data onto your canvas, and I'm just going to save what the state of the data looks like at this moment in time before it flows into my macro. Somewhere I can, in this case, I'll just do it to my desktop. So I'll call this macro sample input, and I'm going to save it as a YXDB. I'm a big fan of saving it as a YXDB for macro development because the data types that exist already in that data set will be carried through. It carries the metadata, which becomes important when we get back into the macro because macros can be a little bit fidgety when it comes to talking about data types. So I'm going to save it, run it, and now I have my data set to build my macro around. So let's go ahead and open a new canvas. Exit out of this one. I'm going to open a new canvas to construct my iterative macro. So let's go in, and first off, I'm going to click my canvas, go to my workflow, and set it to be a macro iterative. So now I'm ready to go. I won't have to worry about that. It's going to allow me to manipulate the interface designer to do iterative tasks. If you get to a point in this training and the interface designer doesn't show what I'm showing, chances are is that you've selected the incorrect type here. So always go back and check that if it's not displaying what it should. So like every macro, I'm going to bring in a macro input. For lack of a better word, you can actually imagine this like an input anchor for a tool. It's basically saying, how is my data going to come into my macro? You have two options to specify what that data looks like. You could actually go in and manually enter what you think that data will look like, or you could do a file input. Now, the reason why I chose a file for the last one is that it saves data types. The problem is if I had some number like this and I entered it into this text input tool and ran it, by default, Alteryx just changes it to what it thinks it should be, so it's an int32. But what if this value to me coming in was actually a string? There'd be a collision in data types of how the data is mapping into my macro and what it actually looks like. This is why I recommend saving that file and using that. So I'm going to go macro sample input, select OK. And now when I run my macro again, switch over to data, you can see that I've got my data exactly as it was from my other workflow and the data type that correspond to it. And the reason that this is important is that this will dictate how your workflow essentially maps into your macro. So it's important to make sure that the fields that exist in your other workflow will exist inside this template. Now, when going to the interface designer, I specify when you're talking about iterative macros, it's important to give your input some sort of name. So I'll just call this macro input. And you can give it some sort of abbreviation. The abbreviations essentially represent what's going to show up on the anchor of a tool. So in this case, an abbreviation might look like an L, J, or R of a join tool. So I'll just call this I for input. Okay, so now I've got my data flowing in, and I've got them sorted by distance in miles. So what I want to do is one by one go through each record and say, what does this record need? Can I supply it? And if I supply it, subtract it from the supply location. So 965 would get their one widget, and my supply location would now be down to 95 widgets to provide to other locations. So in order to capture the top record from each data set, I'm going to bring in a sample tool and choose the first one record to work on. So now I've captured that location, that store location of 965 that needs one widget. And the warehouse location that's closest is 1.81 miles away, and they've got 96. They should be well and away enough to supply them. So let's go through and create some calculations to help build our iterative logic. I'm going to bring in a formula tool and build some pieces that will help us support iterative nature. So the first one I'm going to build is a new field called new supply. I'm going to change this to int32. And I'm going to say if our demand is greater than or equal to supply, then 0, else supply minus demand. Now, the reason I wrote this way is that most people would say, oh, just supply minus demand. But what happens if the demand is greater than the supply at a given warehouse location? We don't want the warehouse to go into a negative deficit of widgets because that would be impossible. We just want to say that it got down to 0 and we just subtracted between the two. And we'll handle that difference down the line. So no worries. New demand, what does that look like? So after we've subtracted 96 from that one widget we needed, we should have 95 as the remainder, right? So let's go to new demand. Actually, this will be the new demand of the store itself. So after we fulfill that one widget, they should have 0 left in demand. So I'm going to go here and say demand minus supply plus my recent field that I just built, new supply. And let's run and look at it and say their supply originally was 96, demand of 1. After fulfilling it, the new supply was 95. And the new demand is 0. They didn't need any more. Now let's calculate how many widgets they really assign to a location. So just finding the difference between that supply and demand here. Again, I'm going to flip these to 32. And I'm going to say supply minus new supply. Run that workflow again, and you can see that, as expected, they assigned one widget to that store location. Now I have one more that I want to build, and it's called remainder demand. And this is basically saying, what was our demand minus how many was assigned? Right? So no more demand left. And we handle it this way because maybe they do have some demand left over. Maybe the store wasn't able to fulfill everything, or the warehouse wasn't able to fulfill anything. So we make sure that we want to capture that. Now, I always hate these very long annotations that don't look very logical. So if you ever want to update those, remember you can go over to your configuration pane, hit annotation, and just say something, calculations for supply and demand. And it looks a lot cleaner after doing that. So after completing that calculation, let's output that one record so we know that it's going to be complete. So I'm going to go over to my select tool. I'm going to sort a few things around. So I'm going to take my supply ID by right-click and dragging, and we'd put that at the top, deselect supply, keep my new supply, keep my demand ID. My demand there is fine. I'll keep assigned, remainder, and distance. I'll deselect new demand. Bring distance miles to the bottom, just organizing this the way I'd want to see it. Certainly you could organize it in a different way. So now after all my calculations, you can see that I have this warehouse location that has 95 supplies left. They did supply store 965 with they needed one widget. They were assigned one, and they have no more demand left over. So that's my data set. I'm going to create an output. Everybody's happy. I'm going to name this, I'll just call it final out, for lack of a better name. And I'll just call it O for anchor abbreviation. So this macro is great, but it only processes one record at a time, right? Now, and the way I have it right now, it would process one record and only one record. But I need to create some logic that basically says, for the rest of the records, throw them through the loop again by the next nearest distance and fulfill that order. Then the next nearest distance, fulfill that order until all my warehouses or stores are exhausted, whichever one comes first. So first, what I have to do is I'm going to bring in the join tool to sort what has been taken care of and what hasn't been taken care of. So I'm going to drag in from my formula tool into a join tool my data set from there, and then everything that originally came in from my macro input. So as I say, what record existed here and here, and I'm going to join them both on demand and supply ID. Very straightforward. So what this should essentially give me is all records that weren't in this top one. So you can see my join said this was the top one, but really everything else I want to grab from this left output. So this is the rest of the data that I want to really iterate through my loop. However, there are some fallacies within this data itself, right? The supply hasn't been updated and the demand hasn't been updated. So for example, store 965, remember it could be appended to many different actual supply locations. So I want to take care and say, this store has been fulfilled. I don't need any other supply locations to take care of it. So I'm going to go into my join tool and say, bring in all those stores from that supply location and figure out these, bring in the results of this formula tool to help do some logic to essentially replace the old supply number with the new supply number. I'm going to join on supply ID and say every supplier should be updated between these two. And I'm going to deselect some fields that I don't feel I need going forward. So let's say I don't need demand ID, demand, these are just from the right side. So I'm going to drop these out. I'm going to keep my new supply though, because I want to replace it with the old supply and deselect the rest of them. Okay. So let's look at our data set from our join. You can see that every supplier that once had 96, I need to update with this value of 95. And then on the left, I have the rest of my data set that wasn't part of that supplier. So I'm going to union these two together after I update my join output. So to update my join output, I'm going to drag in a select. I'm going to say, get rid of that old supply and just call this one the new supply field. And that will essentially make it updated. I'm going to sort this up so it matches in the same order. Okay. So now I'm going to go in and say, I want everything that wasn't that supplier to also match with my updated supplier. Run that workflow. And now I have a full list of suppliers with their most up-to-date values. Now, the other thing that we have to address is our demand. Okay, so we also have to update that my store location no longer needs any more widgets. So again, I'm going to bring in one more join tool. bring a connection from my formula tool and say demand ID equal to demand ID. And I'm going to do the exact same process to update the demand tool, so it might look very familiar. I'm going to deselect a number of fields. And remember, another way to deselect a group of fields is you could highlight the whole group, click Options, deselect highlighted fields. That's also a quick way to do it. But I am going to keep new supply because I'm going to replace it with the old supply. I'm sorry, demand. I'm going to keep the new demand so I can replace it with the old demand. I'm going to run the workflow. And you can see that I have all these stores demanding one from different suppliers. I need to make these say 0 because they've been fulfilled now. So I'm going to go to Select Tool to replace my new demand with my old demand, and then union those two data sets together. So I'm going to bring in a Select Tool, say I don't need my old demand, call this my new demand, move it up within the data set, and then I'll go to my union tool and union these two together. So at this point, I've been able to update my supplier and demander numbers to be accurately represented. So now at this point, I'm pretty happy, but I just want to do a little bit more logic to clean up the data and make sure that it is coming in the same way as it did from the macro input. So remember, this string is going to loop back into my macro input. So what's really important for me to know and make sure is that my shortest distance is at top with all these joinings, and so you just want to assure that everything is in the order that you do intend it to be. Also, we want to filter out anything that really can't play a role anymore in our iterative macro. So for example, I don't want anything where the demand is greater than 0, or I want everything where the demand is greater than 0 and the supply is greater than 0. I don't really want a scenario where I have a demand but no supplier, and I don't want a supplier with no demand. So this expression filters out anything that doesn't need iterative logic on it. We can go ahead and add a sort tool to make sure that my distance is still in order. I do want to make sure it stays the same for each loop. So I'm going to go find my sample tool. Sorry, my sort tool for the true output, and say distance in miles ascending. So now this looks exactly like my beginning data set, only I'm missing that one record off the top that went to my O output. The rest of them I want to cycle back into the beginning of my workflow. So you should see on here I've got 1053 as my second record. Now it's going to be my first record when it passes through again. So I'm going to go to my interface tool, select macro output, and name this. Now, whenever creating an iterative macro, it's up to you what you want to name it. I have the best luck just naming it iterate. So you know this is the one that you want to continue to loop through your workflow. And I'm just going to give it an anchor abbreviation of I. So now our macro is complete. I have a few things to update within my interface designer, but the first thing I want to do is save this macro. So I'm just going to save it, in my case, to my desktop and call this virtual training iterate sample. So I've saved my workflow. Now I can update how it's going to appear within my canvas on my other workflow over here. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to View, Interface Designer. Appears to have popped up somewhere where I can't find it. Hold on one second. Let me save my workflow here real quick. Okay. appears that the WebEx is not allowing me to pop up my interface macro here, from my interface designer. Try one more thing. Okay. So here's my interface designer. I can go into my interface designer by selecting View Interface Designer and going down and selecting this tool that looks like a wrench. And this is the spot that allows me to configure my iterative macro. So I can go in and select a standard icon or a custom icon. I could give it a new look if I wanted to, or I could change what I want it to appear as a tool. And then I could select what I want my iteration to be. So I could select the input properties. So whatever I name this, I'm going to select as my input, and then iterate as my output. Let me switch here because I'm actually working off a different designer. So let's go look at this designer as an example. I've got a macro input called macro input, and the iterative is called remaining supply and demand iterate. So if I went to interface designer here, you can see that I set it up so the iteration of the output is this output. I could specify a maximum number of iterations that I want to participate, and then what I want to do when the maximum number of iterations is hit. So then I'll be good to go. Okay, so let's go back to my workflow here. Let me open it again. There we go. And in this case, I'm going to open my macro by right-clicking, Insert Macro, and then going to my iterative supply and demand macro. Now I can drag my data in to this macro, and again, it should reflect exactly what I wrote into my output data tool. And then I've enabled the mapping functionality within this macro input, so I can make sure that my demand ID goes into my demand ID field. My demand field goes into my demand field, supply ID to supply ID, supply to supply. This is easily switched off by going back to the input tool of the macro and deselecting show map field, but I kept it selected just as a best practice. So now I can go ahead and run my workflow and let my iterative macro run. And down here in the messages, you'll actually see something going on. Let me get to my messages again here. You can see that 226 iterations were run. So it went through 226 times. Imagine what this would have looked like if we had to build it manually. It would have been a nightmare. So now you can look over here, you can see my supplier, how much they supplied, how much they assigned to a certain location, like 965, and the distance that they have. And if the supplier ran out, they went to the next furthest supplier for each store, essentially. So it iterated through, and it took 226 times, but everybody now has widgets assigned to their store location. Now, one thing I do want to point out, if you are watching your macro run, I'm going to run it one more time, but pay close attention to what's happening down here in the message pane. So you can see that I'm getting a number of iterations run and the number of records that remain before they hit that output. So how many are iterating through? How many do I have left? Great. So that's the iterative macro for our supply and demand. Certainly you could do something that's even more simple if you want to test it out. One thing that's always fun is you could just do the exercise of, say, take a penny, right, and double it every day. How much would you have at the end of the month? So you could just say when the date time difference between the two, beginning and the end, reaches a certain threshold, then output it to the iterative macro, or you could just create some sort of interface around it, which makes it interesting. So that's the basics of the macro here. Some of the support resources you'll have after the training is, again, Alteryx community. You can go to community.alteryx.com to view any questions around iterative macros or any ideas. We might have some knowledge-based articles that you can refer to outside this training if you want a more step-by-step tutorial. Again, go to alteryx.com/product training to grab any more resources that you might need. So if you are looking more to learn about batch macros today, you can still go to alteryx.com and view it there. And everybody went to alteryx.com in order to register for this training. But I want to make sure that everybody knew that under this virtual training tab, there's this Watch a Past Session tab. So anything that I covered during today's course is available on a playback, so you can follow along if you want to scrub through and take your time with it. And I'll include the files that were presented during this training, so you could download them and follow along with them. Okay, so that's a really nice resource, and usually you can find these workflows and playbacks available to you the next day after these trainings. The other thing that I'd like to point out is if you're looking for batch macro, you could go through and look at the different macro categories that we have. So if I looked for intermediate, you could go to understanding the data cleansing macro, which is essentially how to edit a macro that's inside of Alteryx, right? There you go, macro development for intermediate users. So this one's going to cover more batch processes or just standard processes. So you could download the files that accompany that and learn more about the other macro types that we have available to you. Finally, we have technical support resources that you can contact at support@alteryx.com. Support@alteryx.com is the ideal way to reach out to our support team because it allows you to upload the workflow, allows you to give a little bit more context to the problem. We also have live chat where you can go to alteryx.com/support, but there is a missing functionality of attachments, which makes it hard to communicate what the issue might be. And then finally, the phone, where you can contact them at 1-888-255-1207. After this training today, you will be redirected to a survey. This survey essentially shapes the decisions around what courses we want to present in the future. We have a section that essentially says which category you're interested the most, and we take these analytics and go forth and say, this is what the people want. So if you want some say in what's coming in the future and what you want to learn more about, please take the survey and give us some comments. It'll help us improve the courses and also give us a better path of what courses to do in the future. Thank you for joining today. I appreciate it. I apologize for the audio difficulties at the beginning. Feel free to enter any more questions into the chat pane that you might have. Otherwise, feel free to go to alteryx.com/training tomorrow to review this recording or refer it to other people within your organization. Thank you and have a great day.